Welcome to the Medical Mnemonist podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each episode, take a journey into the top techniques for medical mnemonics, study skills, board exam tips, and accelerated learning in higher education. Now, here's your host, Chase DiMarco.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we are joined by Camille Roney, who is an academic coach and teacher at Non-Trad Accelerator for non-traditional students. She also was able to get her GPA up from a 2.3 to a 4.0, and now helps other students go through this process. So, Camille, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Chase.
And I said all of that correctly. Non-Trad-Accelerator.com, I believe is
correct.
Website.
Yeah. Nailed it.
Awesome. Well, I think the first question then is really just to explain what a non-traditional student is. It's much more common than it probably was many years ago, and I've also heard many different definitions of what a non-traditional student is. So what do you consider non-traditional student? What leads students to become this terminology?
Yeah, excellent question. I like to take a fairly broad definition of a non-traditional student. To me, that means someone who is pursuing their dream career and going back through academia to achieve that. However, they've also got major responsibilities outside the classroom. So maybe they're a parent or the sole care provider for their own elderly parents. Maybe they're working on the side, whatever big major responsibility they have on, that's impacting their academics in one way or another.
Got it. So an example like this in healthcare is often students, either before or after taking their MCAT during pre-med, they might take a break to do some research, or even during medical school, they might need to take a break before or after some exams to gain more experience, or just to raise a family, to earn more money. All of these sort of categories, basically, if you don't go straight through without any hiccups, you can be considered a non-traditional.
Absolutely. Or maybe you've already had a successful career like myself and have now chosen to go back to school to pursue medicine. Yeah, that's a non-traditional student.
Got it. Well, then I think the burning question would be, how do you raise your GPA from a 2.3 to a 4.1?
Yeah, it's a 4.1 now. It's a bit of a lengthy story, but it wasn't when I went back to school to pursue medicine, I had no foundational study skills, no background in science. It was by the grace of the flying spaghetti monster that I passed high school to begin with. So I basically had no study skills. So when I went back to school, I was so naive. I was under the impression that my life experience would just somehow magically carry me through the core sciences. Obviously, that was not the case. And it wasn't until I had my son at the end of my second year of undergrad, like literally days after that exam, I knew something significant had to change if any medical school was going to look at me seriously. So what I did is I invested in myself majorly. I took a ton of online study courses. Like I got obsessed with learning how to study. And now because I had this newborn and I'm trying to balance nursing with my classes and all that kind of thing, I had to get very intentional with my time. Essentially, I trained myself to become exceptionally productive in short periods of time and made those what study time I did have available to me exceptionally high yield, like straight to the point, no fluff. And I learned, I taught myself how to speed read and all these other techniques that I'd love to introduce to your audience. And I actually now, I study like at a fraction of what I had been before. Don't get me wrong, I was working my butt off at that 2.3 GPA. If I can give you this visual, like my husband and I would go to the grocery store, I would have him drive and I would be in the passenger seat with my calculus textbook open, like on the way to the grocery store. So you can imagine the productivity in that quote unquote study session was practically non-existent. So it was all about how I approached my studies. I didn't magically become smarter, anything like that. It was a big mindset shift. And then I taught myself the skills.
Got it. I love the Pastafarian reference there. Um, well, I think it's interesting, and especially with the population that generally listens to this podcast are often, they're in pre-med or med school or another healthcare profession. And a lot of times during undergrad, you don't realize how inefficient your studies are because it's enough to get by or has been up to a certain point. And yes, we're never taught really how to study properly for the most part. And even a lot of our instructors they're not educational psychologists, they're not cognitive psychologists that know about learning specifically. So there's just a lot of lack of transparency or lack of information for them. So I guess the question would be, when students actually start discovering, hey, I'm falling behind, or I'm just completely booked just to barely keep my head above water, what should they do next? What are some processes or assessments, or how would you approach that?
Step one, in my opinion, is to give yourself some credit. It takes a lot to get to wherever you are in the journey. Like, not everybody has gotten as far as you have. So first, kudos to you. Appreciate that. Enjoy the success that you've maintained thus far. And what I like to say is you've already mastered a very specific way of doing things. And we now know the results that those yield. And if those results, your grades, are not to where you want them to be, then it's time to shift. Try something new. Approach it with curiosity instead of beating yourself up over it. And a lot of us get into this negative inner dialogue cycle of, why can't I just stay focused? It seems like, of course, it always appears this way, so and so, or my peers don't seem to be working as hard as I am, but how come they got an 88 and I barely passed, or whatever the case is? There's a lot of comparisonitis going on there. So again, give yourself some credit. And most of us have never taken a class called How to Read beyond the third grade, yet our skills have supposedly, the demand for those skills has gone up exponentially. So yeah, first, give yourself some credit. And it's time to start paying attention, one, to what that inner dialogue is saying, and two, time to learn something new. And yes, you're trying to learn something new with the course content you're taking, but now it's time to assess yourself and see, okay, is it really my study skills that is lacking, not where I want it to be? Or is it how I'm using my time? I know how to study, I'm just procrastinating, or I'm having trouble focusing. Or maybe it's just you don't know how to read this particular type of course content, like this textbook. Finding out where the lack is, and then you can go from there. But I find the biggest change that comes through is through mindset. And a simple thing that your audience can start doing today is, while they're reading their course content, whether it be a textbook or lecture slides, whatever, as you're going through, just don't even go beyond a paragraph at a time without asking yourself, if I were the professor for this class, how would I make this little small block of content testable? Because when you're asking yourself that as you go through, you're not trying to, you read an entire chapter and then you think, oh, wait, what did I just, I zoned out for half of that, or whatever the case is. Yes, it takes a little bit more time, but then you're not having to go review because you actually comprehended it the first time. And in doing so, you're asking yourself and kind of looking at the content, upside down, sideways, and looking at it differently. That actually allows it to sink in, and you actually start to get creative and enjoy, and it can be fun if you approach your studies with that more open-minded curiosity mindset, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I suck at this content, or I hate this prof, or wherever your mind's going to. That's, even if the thought behind that is true, you have evidence to support, I am failing this class, or my grade's only at this and I need it to be higher. That may be true, but is it helpful in this moment? Yes or no? That's up to you to decide. But mindset is the most significant shift that you can make.
I've been in this podcast in particular for about 3 years, and still there's a few times a year where I come across something I'm just I'm not doing well. I can't get motivated to do this. I'm not learning this as fast as I want to. This is after studying these things for a long time. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not easy. But yeah, just starting off, kind of becoming a little more aware of the situation and potential fixes sounds like a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting once you start paying attention to what your inner dialogue is like repeating over and over and over again. What if you just indulged and leaned in and experienced that discomfort, or, just kind of indulged in those thoughts and see what they're trying to tell you? Because oftentimes your brain's just trying to protect you from discomfort. Of course it is. That means you have like a healthy, fully functioning brain, that your brain's trying to protect you from discomfort and provide you instead with pleasure and shift you to a more pleasurable activity. But it's not always serving you.
All right. So if the first step is really mindset shift, awareness,
Hmm.
I know you mentioned speed reading, and I'm sure there are several different types of tools that you use. Just broad strokes, what are some of the most effective tools that you've utilized in the past?
One is well, first, it's important to find out what your base reading pace is. That'll vary depending on the context of book you're reading. For example, it's going to be different from a rom-com than your biochem textbook, of course, and it should be. But I find one of the easiest things that you can do to increase your reading pace is to use a visual pacer. That could be either your finger scrolling down the page, or a ruler, or a pen, or your mouse if you're at the computer. Reason being, your brain is, of course, attracted to movement. And I personally like to use a ruler because all you can focus on is a single line at a time, and it's blocking any content below the ruler. So you're just kind of focusing on one line at a time, and just start trying to read a little bit faster. You don't necessarily have to read every single word in a sentence. Like, yeah, I'm sure most of us have seen those experiments where there's a sentence and they remove the word the or and you can still get the gist of what message is trying to be conveyed. And those takes a bit of practice. But if you want to get started increasing your reading pace today, I'd recommend using a visual pacer, just your finger or a pen and something, and it keeps your eyes focused exactly where the text is, and you work your way down. There's no other visual stimulation that your brain's focusing on at the time. It's very helpful to get started increasing your reading pace.
So the pacer can really help you focus on the content in front of you and going at a different pace because you're focused on one thing. But at the same time, a lot of times increasing your reading speed, especially when you're first trying out any sort of speed reading techniques, can really decrease your comprehension of the material, especially because it's a new skill you're trying to develop. So it's going to take a little while. Do you have any tips for increasing or at least maintaining your comprehension of this material at a faster speed?
Yeah, absolutely. And that starts with when you first sit down with the content. It's always wise to start by looking over the chapter headings, see what content is going to be covered, and start asking yourself your own questions about what you want to take out of that session. And also break up the time that you're sitting there and reading the content. There's no hard rule that says you have to read an entire chapter in one sitting, unless you choose to. That may be fine. But a lot of us like to use maybe the Pomodoro technique, or you just tell yourself, I'm only going to read 2 paragraphs at a time, and then I'm going to take a sip of water, or whatever the case is, and just break up the content. And that increases the recency and the latency effects of when you're studying. So you're more likely to retain that information. And when you have some questions of your own that you're bringing to the content, like, oh, I wonder why this is, or I wonder what the mechanism is behind this, you're now looking for the answers as you go through the content. And it takes practice. Like, anyone can glance at a page for half a second and then shut it and claim that they've just read it. That may be fine, but then you ask them questions, of course, and there is zero retention. It takes practice and it takes time, but because you've got a base rate foundation to start from, even if you only increase that by a couple words a minute, slowly that builds up, and then you get more confident and you can increase that rate exponentially.
And it seems like something that's been covered before is if you skim the headings and the subheadings, you skim the bolded words in most academic textbooks. If there's any questions at the end of the chapter, maybe skim those real quick, just so your brain is primed for the most important topics in that chapter. Then it makes it much easier when you're going through this to
Yeah,
maintain that kind of level of awareness and recall those points a little better.
absolutely. And I recommend reviewing your notes at least daily and for small chunks. Just break it up. Keep that information fresh.
Gotcha. All right, so we've gone over mindset and awareness, increasing your speed, increasing the comprehension a little bit with this speed. Are there other techniques that you generally find effective?
Absolutely. Testing and pushing your memory skills is a tremendous one, and that's never going to go away. That's not just simply in academia. And that's a matter of practice. And there's tons of different techniques. I'm sure most of you can just Google how to increase memory. Jim Quick has great online courses about how to increase your memory. But honestly, the best way to increase your memory is to start using it. It sounds simple, but most of us don't even have our best friend's phone number memorized anymore. We're so dependent on technology. So your brain gets better at what it practices, just like anything else. So I recommend people start relying on their memory a little bit more, at least implementing it into their daily routine and memorizing some basic things. Like maybe I'll remember one friend's phone number a day for a given period. And then you start to build that confidence and start bringing that back to your academics.
Yeah, and a lot of people will recommend, especially if you're starting off with memory techniques, to do something boring. Remember a grocery list, remember a credit card number. But if you don't see any actual use in it, then it's hard to get motivated to put in that extra effort, that extra time.
Absolutely.
So if you can find something that you're motivated to remember for one reason or another, it'll help a lot more with developing this out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you ever use mnemonic techniques or anything along those lines as well?
Yes, and I love them. Absolutely. Yeah, and song. I find that's very relevant to making up fun little songs relevant to the content. It's amazing. You would think it's so funny. Some of us say that we have horrible memories, but then you can relay the lyrics to your favorite song, no problem. It's interesting how fun that is.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the ABCs are kind of a given, but there are so many different ones. What is it? The Animaniacs had one for all the cities and their capitals, all the states and their capitals. And there's another one for the periodic table. And they're not complicated, they're just rhythmic, and it makes it easier. But I guess my problem would be personally trying to make one on my own. If someone else has already made one, I can mimic it. But
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a challenge for yourself. Get creative.
need to pick a topic and then try it out. All right. So I know we focus a lot on visual mnemonics in this show, Memory Palace, and creating fun little animations that are related to each other and those types of associations as well.
Yes.
I haven't really focused on the audible aspect as much in the past. Might be an
It's
interesting
fun. It's
topic.
not for everybody, but it's for auditory learners. It's a great tool. Oh, I'm thinking of the Loki effect or the Loki technique.
A method of loci, Loki
Mhm.
loci. Yeah, that's the Memory Palace.
Yes, you got it. You
Many
got it.
different names for that same one, which makes it frustrating. Yeah, placing things in locations is easier for us to really recall later on. You know where all of the furniture is in your house, for instance, or where this spatula is in your kitchen. It's just easy to remember locations much better than maybe text-based material. So strong technique, fun technique too, once you get the hang of it, but it's also for certain types of material, I suppose. All right, then I think we've covered quite a bit here. I'm curious, do you have any other topics that you generally use with students or for yourself?
Typically, it always boils down back to mindset. Your memorization skills, your reading skills, your ability to manage your time always comes back to how you frame it in your mind, whatever you tell yourself about that very neutral circumstance. Because in reality, all of the circumstances in our lives are neutral. We'd like to assign them a good or bad, like a moral value. But in reality, it's what you think about them that dictates your feelings, therefore your actions, therefore your results. And a lot of people I find at least are talking about it more is the quote unquote inability to stay focused. But in reality, we can think of typically at least one experience in your life where you were truly present, truly in the moment, whether you were eating like an incredible ice cream cone, or you were being intimate with a partner, or you're riding a bike, or whatever the case, you are capable of sitting and staying focused on whatever it is that you're wanting to. It takes practice sometimes. And I mentioned this earlier. Your more primal aspects of your brain are, of course, trying to protect you from feelings of boredom, of discomfort, so on. And it's looking for that next dopamine hit. And there's lots of ways that you can, strengthen the prefrontal cortex and get things a bit stronger. So you do have the confidence to just sit, be uncomfortable for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, how long? It's usually very short, how long that discomfort to be distracted or to divert your attention. And there's no need for you to act on those urges or whatever it is that's distracting you. There's no need. And it's okay to be uncomfortable sometimes.
I'm going to try not to scratch my face right now. It's itching.
Also, there's nothing wrong with urges. with if you have to scratch or your body's telling you it needs to stretch, there's nothing wrong with it. Just like there's maybe nothing good about it unless you want to. That's fine. But I would love to leave your audience with the reassurance that you are capable, you have gotten thus far, and I'm so excited to see what happens next for these people. Like, just imagine the lives that you are going to touch in the future. That's why you're here. That's why you're doing this. That's why you're trying to memorize all of this crazy material. And it's to serve mankind in whatever unique way that you're going to do that in the future. And what you say to yourself matters. What you say to yourself about yourself matters, especially when you're studying and you're pushing your mind to these new crazy limits. You're capable and you're exactly where you need to be.
That's great. Where can the audience find out more about you?
I'm on Instagram at The Learning Mom. They can also find my online course, the Non-Trad Accelerator.com. And I do one-on-one academic coaching where we get really deep into whatever's going on in your world, whether it's time management with everything that's going on in your life and school to whatever mindset issues are coming up for you. We just hash it out and get right down to the root of things.
Great. We'll have those in the show notes too. Camille Roney, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Cheers.
The Medical Mnemonist podcast is powered by Med School Coach. To access Med School Coach services, including USMLE tutoring and residency admissions advising, visit our website at medschoolcoach.com. Good luck as you prepare for your board exams, and we hope you tune in again next time.